Imagine standing on the deck of a warship, surrounded by nothing but endless sheets of ice. Temperatures so brutal they can freeze exposed skin in minutes, and darkness that lasts for months. No GPS signal, no backup, no margin for error. Welcome to the Arctic, the most unforgiving battlefield on Earth, and the place where the next great power competition will be decided. The question is not whether conflict will come to the frozen north. The question is whether America's Navy will be ready when it does. For most of the 20th century, the Arctic was an afterthought. Military planners focused their attention on the Pacific, the Atlantic, the Middle East warm water theaters where conventional doctrine applied. The Arctic was cold, remote, and strategically irrelevant. Or so they thought. But then something changed. The ice started melting. New shipping lanes opened. Beneath the frozen seabed, trillions of dollars in untapped oil, gas, and rare earth minerals began attracting the attention of nations willing to fight for them. Russia started building military bases above the Arctic Circle. China declared itself a near-Arctic state and began sending research vessels that looked suspiciously like surveillance ships, into waters they had never cared about before. And suddenly, American military planners woke up to a terrifying reality. The United States Navy, the most powerful naval force in human history, was dangerously unprepared for cold weather warfare. They didn't have the ships, they didn't have the training, they didn't have the doctrine, and their adversaries knew it. This is the story of what happened next. This is the story of how the United States Navy embarked on one of the most ambitious military transformation programs in recent memory. A race against time, against geography, against Russia and China, to develop genuine Arctic warfighting capability before it was too late. This is the story of exercises held in waters so cold that machinery froze solid. Of sailors who trained in conditions so extreme that frostbite became an occupational hazard. Of submarines navigating beneath the polar ice cap in near-total darkness. Of strategic planners who looked at a map of the world and realized that the top of the globe, the part most people never think about, was about to become the most contested real estate on the planet. Between 2018 and 2025, the United States Navy underwent a fundamental rethinking of what it means to project power in the 21st century. And the Arctic was ground zero for that transformation. We are going to walk through every dimension of that transformation together. We are going to understand the strategic threat that triggered it. We are going to explore the technical challenges that nearly defeated it. We are going to look at the exercises, the doctrine changes, the new equipment programs, the partnerships with allies, and the hard lessons learned along the way. By the time we are done, you will understand the Arctic not as a frozen wilderness at the edge of the map, but as the central theater of the coming great power competition. Let us start at the very beginning with the geography, because geography is destiny in the Arctic, and you cannot understand the military challenge without first understanding the physical reality of the environment itself. The Arctic Ocean sits at the top of the world, surrounded by the landmasses of North America, Europe, and Asia. It covers approximately 14 million square kilometers, an area roughly 1.5 times the size of the United States. For most of human history, it was covered by thick, permanent sea ice that made navigation essentially impossible. But by the early years of the 21st century, climate change had transformed the Arctic dramatically. Summer sea ice coverage declined by roughly 13% per decade between 1979 and 2020. The Arctic was warming at approximately twice the rate of the rest of the planet. And as the ice retreated, new possibilities emerged, both commercial and military. Two shipping routes of enormous strategic importance began to open up. The Northwest Passage, running along the northern coast of North America, and the Northern Sea Route, running along the northern coast of Russia. These routes offered the potential to dramatically shorten shipping distances between Asia and Europe. A journey from Shanghai to Hamburg through the Suez Canal covers approximately 21,000 kilometers. The same journey through the Northern Sea Route covers approximately 15,000 kilometers, a reduction of nearly a third. For commercial shipping companies, that is an enormous economic advantage. For military planners, it is a strategic nightmare, because whoever controls those sea lanes controls the flow of global commerce. And Russia understood this better than anyone else. Russia has the world's longest Arctic coastline, more than 24,000 kilometers. It has been operating in the Arctic for centuries. It has nuclear-powered icebreakers that dwarf anything in the American fleet. And beginning around 2014, it began a systematic militarization of the Arctic region that shocked Western military analysts. Russia reopened Soviet-era military bases that had been abandoned after the Cold War, built new ones. It deployed advanced surface-to-air missile systems, anti-ship cruise missiles, and electronic warfare equipment to Arctic installations. It established the Northern Fleet as a separate military district, the first new military district created in Russia since the Soviet era, giving Arctic operations a command structure equal in prestige to its other major theaters. Russia was not just interested in the Arctic. Russia was fortifying it. China's approach was more subtle but no less alarming to American strategists. In 2018, China released its first official Arctic policy document, declaring the country a, quote, near-Arctic state, unquote, a designation that has no basis in international law, but that Beijing used to justify an expanding presence in the region. China began investing heavily in Arctic infrastructure, including significant financial stakes in Russian Arctic energy projects. Chinese research vessels, some of which American intelligence assessed as having dual civilian and military purposes, began operating in Arctic waters with increasing frequency. China and Russia held joint naval exercises in the Arctic, and Chinese strategic thinkers began publishing articles about the military value of what they called the Polar Silk Road, a northern extension of China's broader Belt and Road Infrastructure Initiative. For American military planners, the convergence of Russian Arctic militarization and Chinese Arctic ambitions created what they described as a two-front strategic challenge in a theater where the United States had historically been the weakest major power. And in 2018, that weakness was laid bare in a series of internal assessments that generated significant alarm within the Navy's senior leadership. The assessments were blunt. The United States Navy had essentially no genuine cold-weather warfare capability. The service had spent nearly 3 decades after the end of the Cold War deprioritizing the Arctic. Cold-weather training had atrophied. Doctrine for Arctic operations was outdated or non-existent. The Navy's surface ships were not equipped or designed for sustained operations in ice-infested waters. The Navy's submarines, while capable of operating under the ice, had not regularly exercised doing so. And perhaps most alarming, the Navy had essentially no icebreaker capacity. A critical gap given that Russia operated more than 40 icebreakers, including several nuclear-powered vessels capable of breaking through ice several meters thick. The contrast was stark and sobering. While Russia had been investing systematically in Arctic military capability for a decade, the United States had been distracted by counterterrorism operations in the Middle East and Southwest Asia. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan had consumed the military's attention, its budget, and its institutional focus for nearly 2 decades. The Arctic had been neglected, and now, as the strategic environment shifted dramatically, the Navy faced the challenge of rebuilding a capability that it had never fully developed in the first place. The response began in earnest in 2018, and it started with an honest assessment of exactly what the Navy was missing. The gaps fell into several broad categories. First, there was the equipment gap. The Navy's surface ships were simply not built for sustained Arctic operations. Even the most capable destroyers and cruisers struggled in heavy ice conditions. Their hull designs were optimized for open ocean operations, not ice navigation. Their propulsion systems, weapon systems, and sensor suites were all vulnerable to the extreme cold. The Navy needed ships that could actually survive and fight in Arctic conditions, and it had very few of them. Second, there was the training gap. Operating effectively in the Arctic requires a completely different set of skills from operating in temperate waters. Sailors need to know how to maintain equipment in extreme cold. They need to understand how the Arctic environment affects radar and sonar performance. They need to know how to navigate when GPS signals are unreliable, which they often are in high latitudes because of the geometry of GPS satellite orbits. They need to be physically and psychologically prepared for the unique stresses of Arctic operations: the extreme cold, the extended darkness during polar winter, the isolation. These skills take time to develop, and they atrophy quickly without regular practice. The Navy's sailors had not been systematically developing them. Third, there was the doctrine gap. Military doctrine is the set of principles and procedures that guide how a force operates and fights. Good doctrine is the product of hard experience, careful analysis, and rigorous testing. The Navy's Arctic doctrine was, to put it charitably, a work in progress. The service lacked detailed, tested procedures for conducting combat operations in Arctic conditions, for coordinating surface ships, submarines, and aircraft in an environment where communications are unreliable, where weather can ground aircraft for days at a time, and where the tactical situation can change dramatically as ice conditions shift. Fourth, there was the logistics gap. Projecting military power requires the ability to supply and sustain forces in the field. In the Arctic, logistics is an almost incomprehensibly difficult challenge. There are no ports. There are no roads. There are no prepositioned supply depots. Getting fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts, and everything else an operating force needs to a location in the high Arctic requires extraordinary ingenuity and capability. And the Navy had not invested in developing that capability. Fifth, there was the intelligence gap. Effective military operations require detailed, current knowledge of the operating environment. In the Arctic, that means knowing where the ice is and how thick it is. It means knowing where Russian and Chinese forces are operating. It means understanding the acoustic environment, how sound travels through Arctic waters, so that submarine operations can be effective. The Navy's Arctic intelligence architecture was inadequate for the demands of the emerging strategic environment. Recognizing these gaps was the easy part. Closing them was going to require years of sustained effort, significant investment, and institutional commitment at the highest levels of the Navy's leadership. What followed between 2018 and 2025 was one of the most intensive military development programs the Navy had undertaken since the end of the Cold War. The first major step was a series of exercises designed to expose the depth of the problem and begin developing solutions. In 2018, the Navy participated in exercises in the Norwegian Sea and the Barents Sea waters that NATO had contested against the Soviet Union during the Cold War, but that the alliance had largely ignored for 30 years. The results were instructive. Surface ships struggled with seakeeping in heavy Arctic seas. Communications were frequently disrupted. Coordination between surface, subsurface, and air elements was more difficult than anticipated. The exercises confirmed the internal assessments. The Navy had serious work to do, but the exercises also revealed something important, something that would shape the entire subsequent development program. The challenge of Arctic operations was not fundamentally about technology. It was about mindset, about institutional culture, about whether the Navy as an organization was willing to make the sustained commitment required to develop genuine Arctic capability. And in 2018, there were real questions about whether that commitment would materialize, given competing demands on the Navy's budget and attention. Those questions were answered decisively in the years that followed. Between 2018 and 2021, the Navy dramatically increased the frequency and scale of its Arctic exercises. The ICEX program, ICE exercise, which had traditionally been a relatively modest submarine-focused exercise held every 2 years, was expanded and augmented with surface ship participation. ICEX exercises moved from quiet testing programs to major operational events designed to develop and validate new tactics, techniques, and procedures for Arctic warfare. ICEX 2020 was a landmark. Held in the Barents Sea north of Alaska in March of that year, It brought together two nuclear attack submarines, the USS Toledo and the USS Connecticut, along with aviation and surface assets, in a comprehensive exercise of Arctic warfighting capabilities. But even the submarines needed work. The acoustic environment under Arctic ice is extraordinarily complex and different from open ocean conditions. Sound bounces off the ice in unpredictable ways. Temperature layers in the water create sound channels that can mask submarine signatures in ways that are different from temperate water conditions. The algorithms and databases that submarine sonar systems use to classify contacts had been developed primarily for temperate and tropical waters, and they performed less reliably in Arctic conditions. Updating those systems, retraining sonar operators in Arctic acoustic environments, and developing new tactics for under-ice warfare all required sustained effort. Meanwhile, on the surface, the challenges were even more formidable. The Navy's surface combatants, the Arleigh Burke-class destroyers and Ticonderoga-class cruisers that formed the backbone of its surface warfare force, were simply not designed for sustained Arctic operations. Their equipment was vulnerable to ice accretion, the buildup of ice on radar antennas, weapon systems, and other exposed equipment that could render them inoperable in the kind of extreme cold encountered in the high Arctic. Their propulsion systems were sensitive to extremely cold intake water. Their fuel systems were vulnerable to the effects of extreme cold on petroleum products. And their crews were not trained for the physical demands of operating in Arctic conditions. Addressing these vulnerabilities required a combination of material improvements and training investments. The Navy began a systematic program of cold weather hardening for its surface combatants, identifying critical systems and either modifying them to withstand Arctic conditions or developing procedures for protecting them during cold weather operations. Anti-icing systems were installed or improved on radar antennas and weapons systems. Fuel heating systems were upgraded. Cold weather clothing and personal protective equipment for sailors was standardized and improved. And crucially, the Navy began developing procedures for what it called cold weather seamanship, the specific techniques required to operate ships safely and effectively in Arctic conditions. One of the most consequential developments of this period was the return of surface ship operations to the Arctic Ocean itself. For decades, the Navy had essentially avoided sending surface combatants into the high Arctic. The risks were considered too great, the operational value too limited. But beginning in 2019, the Navy began deliberately sending destroyers into the Barents Sea and the Norwegian Sea as freedom of navigation operations and capability demonstrations. These deployments were operationally significant, but they were also important as training opportunities. They gave crews direct experience with Arctic conditions. They identified equipment vulnerabilities that laboratory testing had missed. And they sent a clear strategic message to Russia that the United States was willing to operate in waters that Moscow had come to regard as its own strategic backyard. The 2020 deployment of the USS Porter and USS Donald Cook into the Barents Sea, the first such deployment since the 1980s, generated significant attention and marked a clear turning point in the Navy's Arctic posture. The ships conducted exercises with Norwegian and British naval forces, operated in challenging sea conditions, and demonstrated a willingness to contest Russian dominance in waters adjacent to its most important naval base, the Kola Peninsula, home to Russia's Northern Fleet and a significant portion of its ballistic missile submarine force. These surface ship deployments continued and expanded through 2021 and 2022, becoming increasingly routine. The message the Navy was sending to Russia was deliberate and carefully calibrated. The United States was not going to cede the Arctic to Russian dominance without contest. American warships would operate in Arctic waters. They would exercise there. They would improve their capability to fight there. And they would do so with allies. The alliance dimension of the Navy's Arctic development program deserves particular attention because it was one of the most strategically significant aspects of the entire effort. The United States was not the only NATO member with vital Arctic interests. Norway, whose territory extends well above the Arctic Circle and whose coastline borders the Barents Sea directly, had maintained continuous focus on Arctic operations even during the decades when the United States had deprioritized the region. The United Kingdom had significant Arctic interests and a long history of cold-weather naval operations. Canada had the longest Arctic coastline of any NATO member and unique experience with Arctic sovereignty issues. Denmark, through Greenland, controlled some of the most strategically important real estate in the entire Arctic region. Between 2018 and 2025, the Navy invested heavily in deepening its Arctic partnerships with these allies. The NATO Maritime Exercise Program in the High North expanded significantly. Exercise Cold Response, a major Norwegian-hosted exercise, grew in size and complexity, eventually involving tens of thousands of troops and hundreds of ships and aircraft from multiple nations. The exercises served multiple purposes simultaneously. They built real interoperability between allied forces. They developed individual national capabilities. They demonstrated alliance solidarity in the face of Russian Arctic militarization. And they generated the tactical learning that individual nations could incorporate into their own doctrine development. Norway played a particularly important role. The Norwegian military had maintained cold weather expertise that no other NATO ally could match, and the United States Navy worked closely with Norwegian naval forces to absorb lessons that had been developed over decades of Arctic operations. Norwegian expertise in cold weather seamanship, Arctic navigation, and high-latitude environmental monitoring was invaluable to an American Navy that was essentially relearning capabilities it had never fully developed. The submarine dimension of Allied Arctic cooperation also deepened significantly. The United States, United Kingdom, and Norway developed increasingly close coordination on under-ice submarine operations in the Barents Sea, a region of enormous strategic importance given the proximity of Russia's Northern Fleet and its ballistic missile submarine bases. These three nations' submarine operations required sophisticated coordination mechanisms and communication systems that worked reliably at high latitudes, a significant technical challenge given the limitations of radio wave propagation in the Arctic environment. Communications technology was, in fact, one of the most persistent and difficult technical challenges the Navy faced throughout this period. Conventional radio communications that work reliably at lower latitudes degrade significantly in the Arctic due to ionospheric disturbances caused by the proximity to the Earth's magnetic pole. Satellite communications, which have increasingly become the backbone of military command and control, are similarly degraded in the high Arctic because most communication satellites are in equatorial orbits that provide poor coverage at high latitudes. GPS, which the modern military has come to depend on for navigation, targeting, and timing, provides only degraded service above certain latitudes because of the geometric relationship between GPS satellite positions and the Earth's surface. These communications and navigation challenges were not merely technical inconveniences. They were potential strategic vulnerabilities. A force that cannot communicate reliably cannot coordinate effectively. A force that cannot navigate accurately cannot target effectively. And a potential adversary that understood these vulnerabilities and could exploit or exacerbate them through jamming or other electronic warfare techniques would have a significant tactical advantage. Addressing the communications challenge required investment in multiple complementary approaches. The Navy worked with the broader defense community to develop solutions for high-latitude satellite communications, including exploring the use of satellites in highly elliptical orbits that provide better coverage of high-latitude regions than conventional geostationary orbits. It invested in airborne relay systems that could extend communications range in regions where satellite coverage was limited. It developed procedures for operating in degraded communications environments, what military planners call communications-denied operations, so that commanders could continue to function effectively even when satellite links were disrupted. Navigation in GPS-degraded environments was addressed through a combination of technical and procedural approaches. The Navy accelerated development of inertial navigation systems that track position through accelerometers and gyroscopes rather than GPS signals, that could maintain accurate position fixes for extended periods without GPS updates. It developed procedures for using celestial navigation techniques, the ancient art of navigating by the stars, which work reliably in the Arctic when skies are clear, despite the extreme conditions. It invested in systems that could use terrain features and bathymetric data, detailed maps of the ocean floor, for navigation in the absence of GPS. The sensor performance challenge was equally significant. Radar and sonar systems, the Navy's primary tools for detecting and tracking threats, perform differently in the Arctic than in temperate environments. Radar propagation in the Arctic is affected by the extremely cold, dense air that creates unusual refraction effects, sometimes allowing detection at ranges far beyond normal, but at other times creating blind spots that would not exist in normal conditions. Sonar performance under Arctic ice is affected by the complex acoustic environment created by the ice itself, by the temperature and salinity layers in the Arctic Ocean, and by the biological noise generated by Arctic marine life. Understanding and compensating for these environmental effects on sensor performance required sustained investment in environmental data collection, analysis, and incorporation into sensor processing algorithms. By 2021, the investment in Arctic capability development was beginning to produce tangible results. The Navy's submarines were demonstrating improved performance in Arctic acoustic environments, with upgraded sonar systems and better trained operators producing more reliable contact classification. Surface ship cold weather hardening programs were showing results, with fewer equipment casualties during cold weather deployments. Training programs were producing sailors who were better prepared for the physical and operational demands of Arctic operations. And the doctrine development effort was producing increasingly detailed and tested procedures for Arctic warfighting. But the strategic environment was not standing still. Russia's Arctic military buildup continued and in some respects accelerated. Russian submarine activity in the North Atlantic and Arctic reached levels not seen since the Cold War. The development of Arctic-capable unmanned underwater vehicles presented significant technical challenges. The extreme cold affected battery performance and buoyancy control systems. Navigation under ice without GPS was particularly challenging for autonomous systems that lacked the human judgment that submarine crews could apply. Communications with under-ice unmanned vehicles, necessary to receive their data and transmit new tasking, required innovative approaches given the limitations of underwater communications in Arctic conditions. Despite these challenges, progress was steady, and by the mid-2020s the Navy had developed and deployed several classes of unmanned underwater vehicles that could operate in Arctic conditions. Unmanned surface vehicles, autonomous boats that could operate on the surface of Arctic waters, also offered significant promise, though the ice conditions in the high Arctic limited their utility to the open water summer season. Unmanned aerial vehicles designed to operate in Arctic conditions were similarly developed, providing persistent surveillance capability in a region where operating crewed patrol aircraft is extremely expensive and logistically demanding. Perhaps the most consequential development of the entire 2018 to 2025 period, however, was not in hardware or technology but in institutional culture and strategic commitment. The Navy made a deliberate decision at the highest levels of its leadership to treat Arctic capability development as a genuine priority, not a secondary effort that would be resourced only from whatever was left over after other demands were met, but a core mission that deserved sustained, committed investment. This cultural shift manifested in multiple ways. Arctic operations expertise became a valued career specialty within the submarine and surface warfare communities. Officers who developed genuine Arctic expertise were sought after for key assignments. The ICEX exercises became career-enhancing events rather than niche assignments. The Naval War College incorporated Arctic strategy and operations into its curricula. And the Navy's senior leadership, the Chief of Naval Operations, the fleet commanders, spoke publicly and repeatedly about the importance of Arctic capability development, sending a clear signal throughout the institution about where priorities lay. This institutional commitment was reinforced by the resource decisions that backed it up. The Navy's budget submissions in the early 2020s consistently included significant funding for Arctic-related programs, cold weather hardening, training, exercise participation, unmanned systems development, and infrastructure. The amounts were not unlimited. The Navy faced significant budget pressures during this period, but they were sufficient to sustain a genuine development program. The question of icebreaker capability remained one of the most persistent and contentious issues throughout this period. Unlike Russia, which operated a fleet of nuclear-powered and conventionally powered icebreakers that could project power and maintain presence throughout the Arctic year-round, the United States had for decades relied on a tiny fleet of Coast Guard icebreakers, vessels that were aging, limited in capability, and far fewer in number than the demands of the strategic environment required. The disparity was stark. Russia had approximately 40 icebreakers. The United States had 2 operational heavy icebreakers in 2018, and one of them was in poor mechanical condition. Addressing the icebreaker gap was recognized as a strategic imperative, but the path to closing it was politically and budgetarily complicated. Building icebreakers is expensive. The United States shipbuilding industry had not built a heavy polar icebreaker in decades and had to rebuild the industrial capacity required to do so. Decisions about whether icebreakers should be operated by the Coast Guard, the Navy, or some combination of both were complex and politically contentious. And the timeline for designing, building, and commissioning new icebreakers meant that the gap would not be closed quickly regardless of what decisions were made. The Polar Security Cutter Program, the effort to build a new class of heavy icebreakers for the United States, became one of the most watched and debated defense acquisition programs of the early 2020s. The program faced cost overruns, schedule delays, and design challenges that pushed its first delivery date from 2024 into the late 2020s. The delays were frustrating and potentially consequential, but the program was moving forward, and the Navy and Coast Guard were developing operational concepts for how the new icebreakers would be integrated into the broader Arctic capability architecture. In the interim, the Navy worked around the icebreaker gap in several ways. It increased cooperation with allied nations that had icebreaking capability, particularly Norway and Canada. It developed procedures for using conventional naval vessels in ice conditions, accepting the limitations involved. It explored the potential use of commercial icebreakers for some military logistical functions. And it accelerated development of unmanned systems that could provide some of the monitoring and presence functions of icebreakers without requiring the vessels themselves. By 2024 and into 2025, the results of 7 years of sustained effort were increasingly visible. The Navy was conducting Arctic exercises more frequently and more capably than at any point since the end of the Cold War. Its submarines were demonstrating significantly improved performance in Arctic conditions. Its surface ships were operating routinely in Arctic waters that had been essentially off-limits a decade earlier. Its unmanned systems were beginning to provide genuine operational capability. Its allied relationships in the Arctic region were deeper and more operationally capable than they had been in a generation. And its doctrine and training programs had produced a force that, while still not Russia's equal in the high Arctic, was far more capable than it had been in 2018. But challenges remained. The icebreaker gap was still real. The communications and navigation vulnerabilities in the Arctic were still significant. The logistics infrastructure required to sustain operations in the high Arctic was still limited. And Russia, despite the economic stress of the Ukraine war, continued to maintain and develop its Arctic military capabilities. The competition was not over. It was intensifying. The strategic stakes could not be higher. The Arctic is not just a military theater. It is a region whose resources, whose shipping lanes, and whose proximity to the heartlands of the world's major powers make it one of the most consequential geographic spaces on the planet. The decisions made about military investment, strategic posture, and operational capability in the Arctic over the next decade will shape the balance of power in the 21st century in ways that are difficult to fully anticipate but impossible to ignore. What the Navy's Arctic Development Program between 2018 and 2025 demonstrated, above all else, was the capacity of a great military institution to recognize a strategic challenge and respond to it with seriousness and sustained effort. The gaps that existed in 2018 were real and alarming. The progress made by 2025 was genuine and significant. The work was far from complete, but the foundation for genuine Arctic warfighting capability had been built. The Arctic is no longer an afterthought. It is not a frozen wilderness at the edge of the map. It is the frontier where the world's most powerful militaries are competing for strategic advantage in a competition that will define the 21st century's balance of power. The Navy's sailors who operate in those waters, who navigate beneath the ice in nuclear submarines, who stand watch on the frozen decks of destroyers in the Barents Sea, who fly patrol aircraft over vast expanses of empty frozen ocean, they understand what is at stake. They are operating on the cutting edge of history. The story of the Navy's Arctic capability development is ultimately a story about national will, about whether a democracy can make the long-term, sustained investments in hard military capability that great power competition requires, about whether an institution can recognize its weaknesses honestly, face them without excuses, and do the hard work of closing them. The evidence from 2018 to 2025 suggests that the answer is yes. But the work is not done. The Arctic is calling, and the world is watching. Now here is something to think about as we close this journey together through the ice and the cold and the strategy and the sacrifice of America's Arctic military renaissance. A question I want you to sit with, to wrestle with, to talk about with your friends and colleagues. Given everything you have heard today, the capability gaps, the Russian buildup, the Chinese ambitions, the years of hard work to rebuild American Arctic power, do you believe the United States Navy has done enough to be ready for whatever challenge the Arctic brings in the decade ahead? Or is there a gap that has not yet been closed? A capability that has not yet been built? A strategic mistake still waiting to be made? Think carefully before you answer. Because in the Arctic, the margin for error is measured in degrees of temperature, and degrees of strategic clarity. If this deep dive into military strategy and national security resonated with you, subscribe right now so you never miss an episode. Hit the notification bell, and share this with someone who needs to understand what is really happening at the top of the world.